Israelis today are extremely excited because this is the first snow that's in Israel. And I live in Gush Etzion, and right now there's actually a snowstorm outside. Now, I'm telling you this beyond the fact that, I think it's just very interesting that Israelis get so excited about snow. I would imagine that for those of you from America, Canada, probably are snowed out and are waiting for the sunshine. But the reason I'm telling you this is a few minutes ago, we had a power out. So it could very well happen at any given point during the shear that all of a sudden I will not only zoom out, but everything will go out. So I apologize in advance. So let's try to get in as much as we can while we still have the electricity and the internet going. So this week's Parsha is Parashat Terumah. And the topic of discussion from this point on till pretty much the end of the book of Shemot revolves around the construction of the tabernacle. And it's a very, very interesting division. Simon just posted, I have a source sheet with a variety of sources. And again, I apologize to everyone. My sources are in Hebrew, but I will be referring to quite a few of the sources during the course of the shir for those people who want to actually see them inside, look at them more closely. So I gave you the sheet, but you don't need the sheet to follow the shir right now. So to get back to what we were saying, we have this week's Parsha is Parashat Terumah. Next week's Parsha is Parashat Tetzaveh. In this week's Parsha, we have the instructions for the construction of the tabernacle. In next week's Parsha, Parashat Tetzaveh, there are the instructions for the priestly garments and beyond that, which we'll talk about next week. And then we have at the very end of the book of Shemot, two parshiot, one which is Vayakel, and the other Pikudei. Vayakel parallels our parsha. In our parsha, we have the instructions for the construction of the Mishkan. And in that parsha, we have the execution, where they actually build it. And in Parashat Pikudei, we have the execution of the making of the priestly garments, which parallels next week's Parashat Tetzaveh. So again, we have two Parshiot, Terumah, Tetzaveh, with the instructions for the building of the tabernacle, of the making of the priestly garments, and then Vayakel Pikudei, where that actually happens. And in the middle is Parshat Ki Tisa, where the main topic is the golden calf. And what I would like to discuss tonight is the concept of the tabernacle and a major disagreement among commentaries as to whether the tabernacle is an ideal or whether the tabernacle essentially is a concession. And if I say that it's a concession, what exactly is it that we are conceding to? And if I say it's an ideal, what is the ideal that's embodied in the tabernacle? So let me begin with the school of thought that, in fact, the tabernacle is a concession. And this idea is articulated in a Rashi. This is Rashi, actually not in our Parsha, but in Parshat Ki Tisa. And if anybody has Rashi, you can look at it, or if you want, you can look at my source sheet. And I'll mention the Rashi, but I'll give you the reference also. This is in chapter 31 in the book of Exodus, in Shemot, chapter 31, verse 18. And essentially, this verse is the verse that comes immediately before the sin of the golden calf. And Rashi there makes the following comment. He says, Ein mukdam u'mu'char b'Torah. There is no chronological sequence in the Torah. And then he says, Ma'aseh ha'egel, the story of the golden calf, kodem litzivoy melechet hamishkan, yamim rabim haya. He said that the incident of the golden calf actually preceded the instructions that were given to Moshe to build the tabernacle. It happened many, many days previously. And then essentially he goes on and says, the golden calf was built on the 17th day of Tammuz, and God only forgave the Jewish people on Yom Kippur, the following after that. And it was only the day after that that they began the collections to build the Mishkan. So according to Rashi's understanding, and here it's very important, it's not just that the construction of the Mishkan happened after the golden calf, which everybody agrees. But according to Rashi, even the instructions that were given only after the golden calf. And in fact, the source for Rashi is actually to be found in a midrash, which is typical of Rashi, Midrash Tanchuma. And for those of you who have my source sheet, it's the second reference. And there it says explicitly what you find in Rashi, that the Torah is not necessarily in chronological sequence. And there it says that, in fact, the section of the Mishkan, even though it's written before the golden calf, and that's a reference to our Parashat, in fact, it was actually said to Moshe after the golden calf. And then this midrash goes on and says something very, very interesting. It says, why did God tell us in the aftermath of the golden calf to make a mikdash, to make a temple? So the midrash says, in order that the nations of the world should know that the Jewish people were forgiven for the sin of the golden calf. Why is the tabernacle called the tabernacle of testimony? Because the tabernacle is a testimony to the world that God dwells in our midst. And then there's one last thing which appears in this midrash, which is very interesting, which says, God said to the Jewish people to take gold to be used in the construction of the utensils, in overlaying the various beams. Why? God said, take the gold and let that be an atonement for the gold that was used in the sin of the golden calf. And at the very end, the Midrash quotes a verse from Jeremiah, where the verse says, I will heal you, and from the very, how should I put this, the plague, the wound which you have, you will be healed. So that according to this midrash, the very thing that was the illness or the wound of the Jewish people, that same thing becomes their remedy. If the Jewish people sinned with gold, then the way for them to be healed is by doing something constructive, positive with gold. Now, this is the Midrash. This is where Rashi is coming from. And according to the Midrash, and we're just beginning the discussion, in fact, the tabernacle was not necessarily originally, so to speak, on the table. That's not necessarily what God wanted to be. But once the Jewish people made the golden calf, and in the aftermath, God forgave the Jewish people, God wanted to demonstrate that he in fact has forgiven them. So he told them to build a tabernacle. And not only that, but according to the Midrash, and this becomes very, very important, that the way the tabernacle is constructed is in such a way that it can be a healing process for the Jewish people. It can be a corrective for the Jewish people. So that if the Jewish people sinned with gold, the Jewish people will now do the corrective by now doing something in service of God with gold. So that if you take this approach, it comes out that the essential purpose of the tabernacle is to be a corrective for the sin of the golden calf, to be a testimony to the fact that the Jewish people have now somehow done tshuva, they have repented, they have somehow made amends for what they did. And we will now demonstrate that it's not just in theory, but in reality, that God therefore is now once again connected to the Jewish people through the fact that there is a tabernacle and the presence of God is in the tabernacle. So this is what I'd like to begin with in terms of Rashi's understanding. There's another commentary that I've referred to in a number of podcasts, the Sforno. The Sforno who lived in Italy in the 1500s. And he also tends to give you the simple meaning of the text, but is not necessarily connected to Midrashim. And usually he spells things out much more than Rashi. And this Sforno actually appears at the end of last week's Parsha. This is in Shmot, chapter 24, verse 18. And this is a verse where if you just look at let's just look at it for one moment. In chapter 24, verse 18, it says, and Moshe came into the midst of the cloud. He went up the mountain, and Moshe was on the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights. And then you have our Parsha. So the Sforno says that in our Parsha, and again, I want to just look at this one verse from our Parsha, because this is really the basis of much discussion. In chapter 25, verse 8, it says, Va'asuli mikdash v'shachanti b'tocham. This is our Parsha. God said, and they will make to me a temple, although literally mikdash means a holy place. V'shachanti, and I will dwell b'tocham, in their midst. Okay, now I just want to point out, we'll discuss this maybe a little bit more later, that already the rabbis note in a number of midrashim that it should have said, they will make me a mikdash, a temple, V'shachanti b'tocho, and I will dwell in it. But it doesn't say that I will dwell in the temple, but it says I will dwell bitocham, among them. And so therefore, I think this becomes very, very important. And well, as I said, we'll discuss this later, that it's not only a question of God being in the temple, but essentially the idea of God being in the midst of the Jewish people. And if I go back to what I said a few moments ago in Rashi really, or I should say the Midrash that Rashi is based on, according to the Midrash, the whole purpose of the temple is to show that God is still connected to the Jewish people, that God has forgiven the Jewish people. It's not the fact that God is in a temple. It's the fact that by being in the temple, God is once again connected to the Jewish people. Okay, but we will come back to this verse in a moment. In any case, the Sforno, who I mentioned, says that our opening section was said on Yom Kippur itself. And he said, even though the section, right, our section, comes before the story of the golden calf, but the Sforno also says that, oh, I'm sorry. I just take back what I just said. Okay, I was looking at the wrong line. So let me, okay, if everybody can just erase for 1 second. I was reading the Midrash. So let me go to the Sforno. The Sforno actually says that in the last 40 days that Moshe was on the mountain, that's when God commanded him to build the tabernacle. Now, the verse which he's commenting on, which is the last verse in last week's Parsha, is that Moshe went up the mountain for 40 days. But those 40 days are the first 40 days. And after those 40 days, Moshe came down and there was the golden calf and he broke the tablets. And then he went up the mountain for 2 more periods of 40 days each. And the third set of 40 days ends on Yom Kippur. And that's when Moshe came down the mountain with the second set of tablets. And the Sforno is saying that the commandments, the instructions to build the Mishkan were given to Moshe during those last 40 days. And then what the Sforno goes on to say, which is what's important for me, is that in fact, ideally, there was really no reason to have a tabernacle. And he refers to a very interesting verse in not last week's parsha, but 2 weeks ago. If you look at chapter 20, verse 21, so we have the following. It says, Im mizbach avanim ta'asali, if you make to me an altar of stone, lo tivne eten gazit, don't make it out of stone which has been carved out, which has been hewn. Ki charbecha henafta aleva tchalaleha. Okay, because your sword has been upon it and you have defiled it. Okay, so that's, but the verse which actually I'm sorry, is the verse which I'm having a little hard time tonight. The verse which I wanted was actually a verse before that. If you look at chapter 20, verse 20, it says, Mizbach adama ta'asali, make to me an altar of dirt, V'zavachta alav et olotecha v'et shlamecha, and you will sacrifice upon it your burnt offerings, your peace offerings, tzoncha b'karecha, your sheep, your cattle. And then it says, B'chol hamakom asher azkir et shmi, wherever I will mention my name, avo elecha uverachticha, I will come to you and I will bless you. So what the Sforno says, based on that verse, is that in fact, before the golden calf, there was no need to have a tabernacle. All that you needed, if you wanted to worship God, was to build a simple altar of dirt and bring sacrifices to God, and that could be done anywhere. Not only anywhere, by anyone. And so therefore, from the perspective of the Sforno, and here this is what I want to begin to get into, the tabernacle is not an ideal. And why isn't it ideal? Because what it does is it limits the service of God to a particular place. It limits the service of God to particular people, to the priests who are the ones who do it, to the Levites who assist them. It also limits it in terms of having very, very specific utensils, very, I would even say, elaborate utensils made of gold. And what the Sforno essentially says is that service of God should be something which today we would call, right, equal access, egalitarian. It should be something which can be done anywhere, everywhere, by anybody, irregardless, right, of your means. And the moment we limit it, then that is actually not an ideal. And according to the Sforno, that's what happened in the aftermath of the golden calf. That in the aftermath of the golden calf, there was this necessity to now somehow limit the service of God. And one might even say, okay, again, I'm putting words now into the mouth of the Sforno. So this is not what the Sforno says. This is me maybe embellishing it. That one might say that the golden calf was actually a popular movement, so to speak. It was a mass movement of people who now, okay, decided that they're going to worship God and worship God in what we would consider, we'll speak about this in a few weeks, a very, very problematic way. And in fact, it wasn't necessarily worship of God. It was idolatry. So what Sforno says is, in order to make sure that we get it right, so we're not going to leave it to the masses, but we're now going to limit it to a very, very select group who have proven themselves to be faithful to God, okay, and who will do it the right way according to the right prescription in a very specific, so that by limiting it, we make sure that in the end, it will not be a desecration, but a real service of God. That if I take what we had in the Midrash, it's saying that the purpose of the Mishkan was to be a kind of corrective for the sin of the golden calf. If I take what the Sforno is saying, it could be that it's a corrective, but maybe in a different way, in the sense of now limiting the service of God to a particular place, to a particular group of people. And by doing that, perhaps guaranteeing that what will happen will actually be service of God as opposed to idolatry. Now, I want to just throw into the hopper that it would seem to be from certain comments that Maimonides makes in the Guide to the Perplexed, that one could infer that in fact the once again, the Mishkan is something which is a concession rather than an ideal, because the ideal way of serving God should be in a more abstract form, namely studying Torah, prayer. And Maimonides, in a number of places in the guide, speaks about how the sacrifices, which are very, very, how should I put it, concrete, visceral, was a kind of concession to the Jewish people, okay, who had grown up in pagan environments where this is what was done. So I'm just pointing out that this would be another possible explanation of why one would see that the building of a Mishkan is not actually an ideal. So now I would like to move on to the other school of thought, which does see the Mishkan as being an ideal, the tabernacle as being an ideal. And perhaps the first proponent, okay, or the most outspoken proponent is Nachmanides. And remember, we spoke about Nachmanides last week. And once again, what we're seeing this week is kind of parallels what we had last week. Remember, last week we spoke about chapter 24, the covenant that was done at Sinai. And we had a disagreement between Rashi and Nachmanides as to whether it's in chronological sequence. So once again, that same argument surfaces with regard to our Parashat, the instructions to build the tabernacle. And Rashi, as we saw, says it's not in chronological sequence. And Nachmanides says it is in chronological sequence. And in case, I black out again, so I just want to put on the table, just as last week, I was actually much more of a Nachmanides fan, so too this week. And what is beyond just the question of wanting to see the Torah in chronological sequence, but on a conceptual level, why is it that Nachmanides is so insistent that the section is in chronological sequence? So what he says is the following, and this is Nachmanides on the second verse of our Parsha, and I'm reading in the middle. If you have the source sheet, I highlighted it. He says that after the Jewish people were at Sinai, and they were told by God that they were going to enter a covenantal relationship where there would be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. And in fact, they entered the covenant, right? That's what we discussed last week. So once the Jewish people are now a holy nation, it is fitting that they should have a holy place where God's presence will dwell in their midst, and a place where God will speak to Moshe and command him to the Jewish people. And then Nachmanides goes on, and I'm skipping a few lines, this is another paragraph, where he says the following comment. Sod HaMishkan, the secret of the Mishkan. And by the way, whenever Nachmanides talks about a secret, he's now entering the realm of Kabbalah, the esoteric realm. And I'm not a Kabbalist, and I'm not going to teach you Kabbalah, but I'm going to try to give you a more quote unquote rational explanation for this Kabbalistic concept. He says the secret of the Mishkan is that the glory of God which dwelled on Sinai in a very visible fashion, should now be dwelling in the tabernacle in a hidden fashion. And the Kabbalistic part is, which I'm not going to get into, is, well, what does it mean? Visible. What does it mean hidden? And, and these different levels of I thou encounter. But let me just begin by saying the following, and then I'm going to flesh it out a little bit more. According to Nachmanides, the reason why the tabernacle is an ideal is because the purpose of the tabernacle essentially is for the Jewish people to be having this ongoing I thou encounter with God. To be able to have Mount Sinai not be a one-time event, but an ongoing revelation. And if I had to maybe put it in slightly different language, right? Because we spoke about this a little bit at, after the shir last week when, people stayed on. If you were to see Sinai as being a kind of model, metaphor for a marriage relationship. So Sinai is where the Jewish people and God become wedded, right? And the whole ceremony, right, of the altars and the sprinkling of the blood and Naseh v'Nishma, okay, that was the wedding ceremony. But as we all know, you don't just have a wedding, but then after that, presumably, you live together. And that's essentially the whole point of getting married, to not just have the ceremony, but then to actually now have an intimate relationship. So that's what Nachmanides in effect is saying about the tabernacle. Okay, God came down on the mountain. We had this covenant which we made. We became bonded to God. And now what we're doing is actually living together. And this shows the intimacy of the relationship between God and the Jewish people. And that's why the tabernacle is so important. So that the Jewish people should now be having this ongoing experience of God, the sense that God is in their midst. And Nachmanides supports this idea of how the tabernacle was meant to be from the very outset by drawing very interesting analogies between Mount Sinai and the tabernacle. Okay, so now if you want to just put your finger in one place and then go to another place. So let's start out with the end of last week's Parashat. Look at the end of chapter 24. Chapter 24, verse 15. It says that Moshe went to the mount, goes up the mountain, and then it says, Vayechas ha'anan et hahar. The cloud covered the mountain. Everybody see that? Keep your finger there. Now turn to the end of the book of Shemot, chapter 40, verse 34. Verse 34 says, Vayechas ha'anan et ohel moed. On the day that the tabernacle was constructed, the cloud covers the tent of meeting. The cloud covered the mountain. The cloud covered the tent of meeting. Now go back to chapter 24. Okay, I'm sorry to drive you a little bit crazy. Look at the next verse, 24:16. Vayishkon kvod Hashem. The glory of God dwells on Mount Sinai. Everybody see the expression, the glory of God. Now go to the end, chapter 40. Everybody see it? Chapter 40, the end of verse 34. Kvod Hashem malei et hamishkan. The glory of God fills the tabernacle. Look at the next verse, verse 35. And Moshe couldn't go into the tent of meeting because the cloud was there, and the glory of God filled the tabernacle. So we have the cloud, we have the glory of God. And now one last point, one last thing, go back to chapter 24, verse 17. Umar'e kavod Hashem, and the appearance of the glory of God, ke'esh ochelet, was like a consuming fire at the top of the mountain, la'inei b'nei Israel, before the eyes of the Jewish people, a consuming fire before their eyes. Now look at the very last verse of Shmot, of the book, chapter 40, verse 38. It says, because the cloud of God was on the tabernacle by day, and the fire was there at night, before the eyes of the Jewish people. So, we have the cloud, we have the glory of God, we have the fire, we have everything before the eyes of the Jewish people. By the way, we also have God calling Moshe to go up the mountain. And then after the tabernacle is constructed, the next book is Vayikra, and God called to Moshe. So, on the basis of all these literary parallels, Nachmanides says that the tabernacle, in fact, is a perpetuation of the revelation at Sinai. It's an ongoing revelation, except that the revelation that was at Sinai was overwhelming. As we discussed, the Jewish people were blown away. The Jewish people said to Moshe, like, turn off God. It's like too much. They're trembling. So they stopped becoming ultra-Orthodox at the tabernacle. They're no longer trembling. Why? Because the presence of God is more contained. It's something which is more hidden. And as a result, it's something which, on the one hand, is a very powerful experience, but it's something which they can more easily deal with. So if I can just summarize, according to Nachmanides, the significance of the tabernacle is that it's the natural follow-up to Mount Sinai. And again, if you take my analogy, after the Jewish people and God become married at Sinai, now the Jewish people and God are now living together through the tabernacle. And that's what was meant to be all along. And this is reflecting, right, the intimacy of the relationship. And not only that, what I would say is ultimately playing out the whole point of the covenant. That the covenant was to create a relationship and to then express that relationship. And that's what's happening in the tabernacle. I would also like to point out that according to the Ramban, he's emphasizing much more this idea, or maybe I should phrase it slightly differently. Whereas, let's say the Sforno, or maybe what I said to you about Maimonides, we're saying how the tabernacle was a concession, and it was a concession because they saw the essence of the tabernacle perhaps being this idea of service of God. And the reason why it's a concession is because what it's doing is it's limiting, right, the opportunities of service of God. Nachmanides is seeing that the essence of the tabernacle is not so much the service of God as much as the manifestation of God, the revelation of God, the ongoing revelation. And maybe that's something which is absolutely essential to the Jewish people, to be able to see that God is with them all the time. And again, you'll excuse me for belaboring this, but if I take the analogy to a marriage, I would assume everybody would agree with me that after you have the ceremony, okay, you would actually like to live together as opposed to having, right, a Zoom relationship, or having not even a Zoom relationship, but, email. So that's exactly the point of the tabernacle, according to Nachmanides. Now, since I'm a little bit concerned about having another blackout, so I'm going to actually skip to one of the references that I have, and this is the Ha'amek Davar. I've referred to him in the past. Literally, Ha'amek Davar means to get to the depth of the matter, and the rabbi who wrote this commentary is the Nitziv, Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin. He lived in the middle to late 1800s in the yeshiva of Volozhin. He was considered to be the head of the yeshiva. And he has a very, very, by the way, he actually did an innovation in the yeshiva, which I think is really very interesting. Everybody's familiar with that. Generally in yeshivot, especially Lithuanian yeshivot, they spend pretty much all the time just studying Talmud. And in fact, the classic joke was the way you learn Chumash, right? The way you learn the Bible is through the Talmud. So he actually instituted in his yeshiva that every week they should have an hour where they learn Parashat Shavua. That he thought it was important that they should actually learn the weekly Parsha. And actually, he would bring in a lot of oral law in his interpretation of the text. So let me give you this one explanation which he makes, and it's on my source sheet for the people who have it. This is reference number 7. And this is giving another dimension to the tabernacle and why the tabernacle is actually not a concession, but an ideal. And he says the following. All of the details of the tabernacle correspond to all the details of the world which God, may he be blessed, created. And God dwells in the world at large. And God commanded that the Jewish people should make a kind of model of the world in the tabernacle and its utensils. Which means that according to the Nitziv, the tabernacle is in fact a model, a symbolic model of the world at large. It somehow mirrors different elements in the world at large. And why is this an ideal? So now what I'm saying to you, this is, the Nitziv doesn't say this. This is again my commentary, so to speak. What I'm embellishing the Nitziv. If I look at the beginning of the creation story, right? The very beginning of the Torah, and we've spoken about this on a number of occasions. The beginning of Breshit is so beautiful, how God created this world, and especially you look at the first chapter of Breshit, right? At every phase of the creation story, God looks at this thing and says it's good, and God looks at that thing and it's good, and God looks at everything which God created and it was very good. And that's chapter 1. And then when you get to chapter 3, from chapter 3 on, everything is downhill. And in fact, a point which is really very, very traumatic is the end of Parashat Breshit. chapter 6, where it says that God regretted creating people, regretted creating the world, because the inclination of people is only evil. So that if you think about what's going on here, here is God that created a world which is completely good. Here is God who created people, and where the mission of people was to somehow bring the world into relationship with God. And yet what you find is one story after another story, how the people are taking this good, beautiful world, destroying it, taking a world which began as being very good and then making it very evil. And if I might even add, and this is what I want to really get to, the more that people are bringing evil into the world, the more people are in effect pushing God out of that world, disconnecting God from that world. And on a certain level, perhaps it reaches a certain climax in the enslavement of the Jewish people in Egypt. And in everything which the Egyptians perpetrated against the Jews. They are perhaps blotting out any awareness of God and any connection of God to the world. And we've discussed this before. When Moses comes to Pharaoh and says, "Thus says Hashem, send my people out." And Pharaoh's response is, "Mi Hashem, who is this God? I don't know him." And I mentioned to you, right, we've done this, that the whole purpose of the 10 plagues was getting to know you. And I also mentioned that the whole purpose of the plagues is essentially to bring Egypt back to a primordial state of darkness, of chaos. And then, as Egypt is reverting back to this primordial state, the Jewish people are now creating a new order, which has new light, a new creation. And that new creation of the Jewish people, and now I'm trying to bring together a few things we've discussed over the past few weeks. That new creation of the Jewish people ultimately has its goal to bring God back into the world. If everything up to that point was pushing God out of that world, if everything up to that point was taking the world on a course of evil, to now bring the world back to a path of good, and through that to bring God back into the world. And in that vein, that's where the tabernacle becomes a critical step. The Jewish people, by building the tabernacle, are not just building a home for God in the tabernacle, but a home for God in the world at large. The purpose of the tabernacle was to be a model that would then radiate outside the tabernacle, and to be able to take that presence of God, which was in the tabernacle, to now expand out to the world at large. By the Jewish people having a place, a mikdash, a holy place, and through that holy place to be a goy kadosh, a holy people, to then use that as a springboard to be mamlechet kohanim, to be a kingdom of priests for the world at large, to have that temple radiate to the world at large and bring the concept, and not the concept, the presence of God to the world at large. So that when it says Va'asuli mikdash in our parsha, and they will make to me a tabernacle or a holy place, and I will dwell among them. So among them is not only in the tabernacle, but among the Jews. And what I would like to say is, and not only among the Jews, but ultimately in the world at large. So that the construction of the tabernacle is a way of somehow now bringing God back into the world, bringing the world back to its original intent. In fact, if I could just add this point, if in the beginning of Bereshit, God creates a world for people to dwell in, to bring in relationship to God, the Jewish people now create a mini world, the tabernacle, for God to dwell in and to enable God to now come in contact, not only with the Jewish people, but the world at large. And since, thank God, I guess there is a God in Israel, so I'm able to finish this year. So I want to just end off with one last point, which actually appears on my sheet. It's the very last comment. By the way, I can't resist saying this, so I'll have to say this. You know, one of the commentaries I brought on my sheet is the Abarbanel. And, you know, I said there's a whole discussion among commentaries. Is the tabernacle a concession? Is it an ideal? But then there's a whole other discussion among commentaries also as to whether you should actually look for meaning in all of the details of the utensils and of all the construction that you have in the tabernacle. You know, and so for example, Nachmanides in the Guide to the Perplexed says, don't start, you know, getting into all the details and trying to find some deeper meaning into what was going on over there, because, you know, it had to be built a certain way and you had to have certain specifications. So, you know, it could have been this way, it could have been that way, but, you know, don't try to read more than is there. And the Abarbanel, for example, not on the Abarbanel, quite a few commentaries. And by the way, if anybody's interested, I would highly recommend reading Rabbi Samson Hirsch's commentary on the tabernacle, on sacrifices, on ritual purity. He's really into it. And so, but in any case, all these commentaries break their heads to try to come up with what is the symbolic meaning behind all the different details that you find in the tabernacle. And they try to see that there is something which is much more at stake here. Now, by the way, again, if you take, for example, the explanation that I've just quoted in the name of the Netziv, if in fact the tabernacle parallels what's going on in the world, so that also raises an interesting question. All the different things we see in the world, does everything have a purpose? And if you believe that everything that was created has a purpose, well, should I break my head to try to understand what the purpose of everything is? And I would generally say yes. And not only that, that's presumably what you do in this field of science, where you try to understand what are the different manifestations that you have of everything in the world, and, you know, and why is it there and what is it doing? And not only that, ecosystems and how different things impact on each other. So then that should be true also of everything in the tabernacle. But I usually try to illustrate this with an example that I think is true. And, you know, take an example, trivial example. You're building a house. Now, I've been through this a number of times, right? And then how much do people agonize about what tiles they're going to have right? What ceramic tiles they're going to have, or what kind of floors they're going to have, or how big they have to be. Who cares if it's like, a meter by a meter or this, big deal. But people agonize and exactly what are going to be the dimensions of the room and where exactly. Now, most of the time when people agonize, I think it's just nonsense. But on the other hand, a lot of times it's not nonsense, because a lot of times it's a reflection of what do you see your house being? And what do you see as being, what do you see even at the centerpiece of your house? By the way, something to think about, right? Because, if you look at our Parsha, I'm sorry, I'm starting to get a little carried away. If you look at our Parsha, you see that when they start mentioning the utensils, what's the first thing which they mention? The ark. And why do they mention the ark? Because the ark is the centerpiece, so to speak, of the tabernacle. The ark is in the Holy of Holies. The ark is where you have the tablets of stone. The ark is where the presence of God comes down and speaks to Moshe. So that's the most important thing in the tabernacle. So now think about this, right? I'm not intending to, press anybody's buttons. But, for a lot of people, right, your centerpiece in your house might be your living room. Maybe some people it's the kitchen, I don't know. But it might be the living room. And what do you have in your living room? Now, it could be some people have a huge screen, and some people have books. It's an interesting question. So what does that say? What is it that's, the center of your occupation? Okay? What is the environment that you're trying to create? So I'm just saying the details, how do you furnish it, right? And what statement do you want to make? So the details become very, very important. Anyway, I got a little bit sidetracked, but you'll see it's going to come together in 1 second. So the last reference which I have is the Malbim. And I think it's really very interesting that he says the following comment. If you look at the second verse in our Parsha, and again, just to show you how reading the Torah, you have to be very careful. In the second verse, chapter 25, verse 2, it says, speak to the Jewish people, the Yikhu Terumah. Now, for people who know Hebrew, the Yikhu means take to me Terumah. What's Terumah? A contribution, a donation. And then it says, may eight kol ish, from every man, asher yidvenu libo, whose heart is generous, tikhu et trumati, you should take my contribution. So I'm apologizing that I'm going a little bit over, but I'll try to do this as quickly as I can. So I want to focus, and again, to show you the richness over here of the words. It should have said, the yitnuli, they will give to me a contribution. But it says you should take a contribution. So this commentary, the Malbim says, if it would have said they should give it to me, and it could have also said, command the Jewish people, then it would have meant that God is now saying to the Jewish people, you must give me X. But by saying v'yikhuli, so the interpretation that he gives is, appoint some collectors who, if the Jewish people of the goodness of their heart decide to contribute to the tabernacle, they will be available to receive the contributions. I hope everybody followed that, which means that you're not forcing the people to do it. The whole construction of the tabernacle is non-coercive. It's based on free will. It's based on the generosity of the heart of the Jewish people. And now if you think about this, what God is saying is, if you want me to be in your midst, then now show me that you want it. So you now show me how much it matters to you. Show me the generosity of your heart. And by the way, this commentary of the Malbim says, when it says the generosity of your heart, it says whatever people give. And he emphasizes the point. Whether it's a lot or whether it's a little, everything is welcome. And not only that, me'et kol ish, from every person. Where here it doesn't mean every man, and we'll discuss this a few weeks from now, but everyone, men, women, whatever. Why? Because the tabernacle is not the project of one individual. It's meant to be this collective project, a collective project which is based on the generosity of heart of each and every single person. And now I want to just get to the last thing, which is the word Terumah. Terumah, and that's the name of the parsha, is generally translated as a donation, a contribution. But in fact, if you're familiar with the Hebrew, the root is Resh Vav Mem, which means to lift up, to raise. And with the idea being over here, it's not just that the Jewish people are contributing money or materials. In the process of contributing this money, they are sanctifying it. They are elevating it. They are in effect saying, okay, that this should now be used for a higher purpose. And by the way, this becomes a very interesting question in terms in general of how we see our possessions. Of how much is it that our possessions are there to serve us, self-gratification, or how much is it that maybe we have a way of somehow elevating them for some higher purpose? By the way, I also want to say, even if our possessions are serving us, but do we actually maximize their usage in serving us, right? We have food. Do I eat all the food that I have that I could and that, or do I simply discard it? How much do I actually take care of my possessions? How much do I recognize that whatever I have has a purpose and allow it to actualize, maximize its purpose? Now, why am I saying all this? And this is how I will end. If the Jewish people of their own free will now contribute to the Beit HaMikdash, and if they now take this gold and silver that they have and use it for a higher purpose, and realize that ultimately whatever they have should be used for some higher purpose, and in effect recognize that in everything that exists in the world, there is the potential for holiness, and then do that, that's what in the end invites God's presence to be in the midst of the Jewish people. If the Ramban really emphasizes the idea of God's presence continuing to reveal itself on an ongoing basis, and that was the purpose of the tabernacle. So what I wanted to end with was to say that, but for that to happen, it means that we have to invite that presence. And therefore, we have to show that we really want it. We have to show the generosity of heart. We have to be able to show that we are interested in sanctifying a reality. And the degree to which we create that framework, that's what invites the presence of God. So that ultimately, so to speak, the ball is in our court. Okay, thank you everyone for bearing with me. Shabbat Shalom.